Chapter 8 Renormalization, Time 1 and Non-Time 0, Mass and Energy. A problem arises out of current attempts to explain nature always in terms of energy and matter. Physicists have mathematically surrounded the electron with vacuum cloud of virtual photon particles that are said to pop out of the vacuum cloud, after which the electron reabsorbs the virtual photon particles. When the rules of quantum mathematics are used to determine the amount of energy involved in these processes, the mathematical conclusion is that these electrons and their clouds possess infinite mass energy. The difficulty with these mathematical conclusions is that electrons do not have infinite mass. To overcome this problem, physicists do something that defies mathematical rules. They cancel out the infinites by dividing both sides of the equation by infinity. These rules of mathematical convention are violated to reach the answers they are looking for. Physicists call this renormalization. Even after canceling out the infinities, quantum mathematics ignores the amount of the electron's mass. Because physicists already know the amount of the electron's mass, they arbitrarily ad hoc plug it into the equation to reach satisfactory conclusion. But in so doing, they have created a paradox: how to deal with infinite mass energy. Something is wrong. This paradox stems from their artificial creation of an electron that continually generates energy from its cloud of virtual photon particles, which is less than something that comes out of nothing and is continually reabsorbing this energy. This problem and paradox would not arise if the 0 of the antimatter state and the 1 of the matter state that are the basis of the electron's nature were understood. For the electron to function, it must both absorb and emit. Contemporary physics has failed to identify the 0 of antimatter states after emission and the 1 of matter states after absorption. Absorption places the electron in a positive energy state, and emission places the electron in a negative energy state. Understanding the balance between these two states of negative and positive energy, and including them in the mathematics, will remove the counterintuitive paradox of infinite mass energy. To understand electrons, it is important to contrast the electron's emission and absorption of a particle, photon, with its absorption and emission of the 0 of non-photons. As the electron emits a 1, it absorbs a 0, and when it absorbs a 1, it emits a 0. The electron emits and absorbs photon matter states, and the electron emits and absorbs the non-photon antimatter states. This provides the necessary symmetry and balance to remove the questionable conclusion of infinite mass energies. Time 1 and non-time 0. What is time? Volumes have been written on this difficult subject, but after much searching, I found the answers to what time represents to be unsatisfactory. What is presented here is an interpretation of the nature of time. The equations of Newtonian mechanics enable physicists to treat time as traveling both forwards and backwards. The mathematics has no restrictions on reversing time. Why is this convention allowed when it is observable that events travel from past to present? Both natural and human events move toward the future and not toward the past. Observation shows that time moves forward and not backward. Time is unidirectional. An arrival in the present is dependent upon a departure in the past. To reverse time is to claim the past is dependent upon the present. Humans are dependent upon the accumulation of past knowledge to reach future emission to absorption events. How can we retain our memory of the past and at the same time physically return to a past that has not yet produced any stored memories? To go to the past necessitates the past becoming the present. If we could retain knowledge from reversing time, it would mean we could have knowledge of the future. However, we can never know the exact future in advance. Our acquired knowledge depends upon past events up to the present. To travel backwards in time would negate all the episodes of our experiences between the point traveled back to and the present. Even if we could, what is the point in traveling backward in time if there is no retention of our experiences acquired forward in time? The question is, how it is possible to remove events that have already transpired in order to move back to a previous existence? Observation indicates a reasonable conclusion that this is not possible. The ability to return to the past has never been demonstrated. Instead, let us approach traveling backward in time as a faulty interpretation and use of the Newtonian equations. What is there about Newton's equations that allows a reversal of time in a universe that does not allow it? A definition of time is necessary to answer this question. A clock provides humans with two processes. One is position and the other is motion. Position is obtained by identifying a specific time of day. When we want to measure how much time, we construct a length for motion. To establish a time of day, the mind reaches an assumed fixed position for the motion of the clock's hands. This position of the hands relates directly to our position on Earth relative to the Earth's assumed position with the Sun. Knowing our positional relationship with the Earth and the Earth's relationship to the Sun enables us to determine and reach positions relative to the things around us. We can then schedule our time and acquire future fixed positions in time with other objects of choice. To ask how much time occurred is asking how far the hands of the clock, moving at a constant rate, moved between the assumed positions of the hands. Assumed position for the hands before and after motion gives us a defining process for the length of motion. Asking how much time has passed is asking what is the length of motion. The question, what time is it, is answered by the assumed positions of the hands of the clock. A stopwatch identifies actual position for the hands relative to the watch and ourselves by stopping the hand's motion. Stopping the hands gives the observer a fixed positional location for the hands. The motion and position of a clock are necessary to define each other. Motion is used to reach the non-motion of a fixed position time of day. The non-motion of fixed positions is used before and after motion to measure how much motion occurred. How much time is all about motion, and the time of day is all about position. A clock is referred to as a timepiece, but in reality, a clock is both a timepiece and a motion piece. This follows the principle that all structures, human and non-human, use both motion, emission, and non-motion, absorption. This dual necessity of motion and non-motion, position, demonstrates the necessity of opposites in defining each other. It also shows the necessity of using one opposite after the other, where motion is a prior requirement of position and position a prior requirement of motion. opposites are never simultaneous. Motion is used to reach position, and position is used before and after motion to frame the length of motion. Motion is a prior condition for defining position, and position is a before and after necessity for defining motion. The example of the clock shows that the no time is to reach a fixed position for the clock, which relates our position with the assumed position of the Earth relative to the Sun. Is the mental absorption, non-motion, of fixed locations for the clock a time occurrence? Is time itself a positional representation? Are time and position synonymous? Nature's actions have demonstrated the two stages of motion: emission and position, absorption. The common phrase time and motion blends time with motion. My own observation is that time is position, which means time and motion are separate in their occurrence, but are together in their dependency on each other. To believe that time actually occurs during motion is to involve both position, absorption, and motion, emission, simultaneously. Instead of time being simultaneous with motion, time is the opposite of motion. Time is the non-motion of position, absorption, necessary to define motion. Motion, emission, is necessary to define the non-motion of position, time. And motion is also the energy process of an object necessary to reach a state of time, absorption. To ask how much time has passed is an imprecise question. The precise question is how much motion has occurred between time events, between the start and stop of motion. To determine 2 hours of elapsed time on the clock, we mentally stop the motion of the clock for the first positional notation to start the 2 hours of motion. For example, 12 o'clock. In telling time, we perceive a specific position, time, on the clock for the start of motion. Time is position. The clock's positional starting place of the 2 hours is like the runner's positional starting place before a race. From this first position, we mark the beginning of the runner's motion as we mark the beginning of the clock's motion. When 2 hours have elapsed, from 12 to 2 o'clock, we come to a second state of absorption, time, ending our use of the clock for this period of motion. The clock was used to relate 2 hours of the Earth's motion to position with the Sun and 2 hours of human motion to position with the Earth. We surround the motion, emission, of the clock with time, position of start and stop, to reach a specific period, 2 hours, for motion. It is the assumed time, position of the clock's hands before and after motion that frames, defines this length of the clock's motion. It is assumed time because the hands of most clocks continue to move when position is determined. The assumed position of the hands in motion represents a specific time of day. Therefore, time is a positional and absorbing event as our thoughts are positional and absorbing events. Human absorbing processes are time events of position. Time as a positional concept means that all mental measuring and defining processes are time events. The use of our senses involves motion bringing us objects for absorption, mental time events. Our sensory organs reach absorbing time sequences through motion, emission. To generalize, all absorbing processes are time events, human or non-human. The fillings of all holes are time events. Although time is universal, it is only relative to when an object absorbs. Each structure's amount and rate of absorption is different. Therefore, the time pulse, a time event, for each structure is different. All structures have their own individual time pulses. As humans, each of us pulses with our own time. There is not a universal clock ticking the same time for all of us. All objects tick, pulse, with a time of their unique absorbing events. It is not just the clock that shows time comparisons. Every structure in nature pulses with time at each of its absorbing events. Nature's time events define our existence. All definitions are measurements derived by reaching our time position events through comparing and relating to the time position events around us. Human survival depends upon the success of time comparisons. The clock is only one device among many for defining our relationship with nature. By defining time as a positional process, and then by separating it from motion, the question of why the Newtonian equations allow time to travel both forwards and backwards can be answered. Newton built his equations to define both the motions and the positions of objects, such as the moon and planets, that are in constant relative motion to ourselves and to each other. To accomplish this, Newton incorporated position as a simultaneous part of motion. As discussed, motion and position are necessary in defining each other. However, incorporating position during motion is assumed position rather than actual position. Physicists have not recognized the significance of the difference between assumed positions during motion and their presumed and invented actual positions during motion. When time, positional non-motion, is imposed upon motion and perceived as an actual and simultaneous part of motion, then time and motion cannot be separated. The motion of an object has been incorrectly imposed upon the separate occurrence of time, and positional time is incorrectly imposed on the separate occurrence of motion. When physicists reverse the motion of Newton's equations, time, position, is also reversed because the mathematical equations require time to be a synchronous part of motion. Without realizing that these mathematical positions during motion are an assumption of position and not actual position, there is an erroneous perception of a reverse flow of time, position, when reversing motion's direction. Newton's equations need only assume positional time during motion. Actual time in nature is never a simultaneous part of motion. In Newton's equations, even forward time conveys the false notion that time is continuous with motion. In the real world, position, time, and motion are separate. Motion, instead of being part of position, is used to reach position, time. The phrase flow of time incorrectly denotes time as a motional concept. The concept of flow is one of motion used to reach the non-motion of positional time. Time itself is not directional. Direction is part of the motion used to arrive at time. The terms forward and backward are part of motion, and it is misleading to use them in describing time. Direction is used for reaching time. Time is a description of the non-motion of an object relative to its arrival in the hole of an absorber. To say time machine marches on can be more accurately restated: objects march on in motion to reach time through arrival. A time event is an arrival in the hole of an absorber. Future time events depend upon past events of position. A time pulse cannot be reached unless motion starts from the present time event of arrival to reach a future time event of arrival. The time event of future absorption depends upon the departure event of emission from a past time of position. Motion, emission, is a departure of time for reaching a new arrival of time. Time must always be forward because all present time events are dependent upon all past time events. To arrive at the pulse of time is also to depart from a prior time event. The fill of the pulse of time for one object is provided by motion, and it is this same motion that also produced an empty state for another object. Emission is the departure of time 1 resulting in an empty condition for an object. This places the object in a non-time 0 state. Absorption is the arrival of time placing an object in its filled time state. To absorb is to gain time, and to emit is to gain non-time. To gain non-time is the same as the loss of time. Objects in nature pulsate, oscillate, between the two states of time 1 and non-time 0. The pulse of time is defined by the pause of non-time between the pulse of time. The switching of a switch is the beat and non-beat of time. The on is the beat of the fill, and the off is the non-beat of the empty, non-time required to both determine the beat and to return to another beat. To sense a beat or pulse is to gain awareness of the on part of the switch. However, this awareness is only possible with the off of a non-pulse between the on and the next. Time is ill-defined when we insist that actual position is a simultaneous part of motion. During motion, position is assumed, but it is not an actual position. The actual position of time is before and after motion instead of during motion. The purpose of motion is to reach a time event. The goals of all life forms are to reach positional time events. The spaces provided by the human heart must pulse with the time of filling these spaces for life to continue. Every structure has its own special time beat. If a structure is built to fill and empty one time, then it has one time beat. To live longer requires more episodes of time. Living is a life and death process. Life is an event of absorption. A life 1 event must be preceded by the death 0 event of non-time. See Chapter 12 for a discussion of life 1 and death 0. To reach a time event is to replace death 0 with life 1. Death is permanent only when life cannot continue with a time occurrence. Time for any structure stops when it is unable to absorb fill. How long we live depends on these continuing beats of absorption. Our system must continually build and maintain zeros and the ones that fill time and empty non-time those zeros. A structure's cessation of time signals its termination of absorption. Non-time 0 is the antimatter state necessary for time 1 and the matter state. The wave motion produces both non-time and time. The beginning of the wave is the beginning of emission and is non-time for the object emitting. The end of the wave is absorption and time for the object absorbing. The wave is an object's use of the field of nothing for its propagation, motion. Emission is the wave required to produce the empty of the non-time state of antimatter. The wave is also required for the fill of absorption, that is the reaching of time and the matter state. The collapse of a wave is the departure of motion with the arrival of a time state. The starting of a wave is a collapse of the filled time state to the empty of the non-time state. Time and non-time are the charges of positive and negative states. Time is the positive plus matter state and non-time the negative minus antimatter state. This integrates seemingly different concepts. Time is part of absorption, fill, position, addition, positive charge, plus 1, arrival, wave collapse, and the matter state. Nontime is part of emission, empty, motion, subtraction, negative charge, minus, zero, departure, wave, and the antimatter state. When seemingly different concepts are unified, this gives evidence that we are moving in a correct direction toward greater knowledge. The connecting things together phase for the mind always advances our knowledge. The act of unification reduces the amount of absorption necessary for gaining more knowledge. The question may arise, if absorption is time, then why not absorb and remain in a time condition? Time would then be continuous and unchanging. This would allow a continual presence of time. However, this would also result in a static and unchanging structure. The object would be suspended in a state of absorption. In reality, every object is built to pulsate between time 1 and non-time 0. The frequency of these fluctuations varies with the geometry of the structures. If the in time and out non-time frequencies are too high or too low, the system will not survive. Humans pulsate with a multiplicity of time and non-time occurrences. Every absorption is a time beat, and every emission results in a non-time beat. Every fill is a pulse of time, and every empty is a non-pulse of non-time. An awareness of and the ability to have a pulse depends upon the in-between phase of not having a pulse. There is a simple concept of position 1 entering a 0 reached by motion, waves. Time relative to humans is rapid during the good days of many successful arrivals. An arrival is a time event of absorption. The bad days are when repulsion is rampant and motion is unable to reach arrival, time. Time moves slowly during the bad days because of our difficulty in reaching a time occurrence. When time moves rapidly, its beat is defined by the short periods of motion between beats. Faster time is a higher frequency defined by shorter periods of motion. Slower time is a lower frequency defined by longer periods of motion. Physicists today consider time to be unceasing and that it always continues with an uninterrupted flow. However, time cannot continue unless it is discontinued and interrupted with non-time. Our paradoxical view of motion and position is the source of our inability to recognize the on and off processes of time. The perennial paradoxes of time, Zeno's paradoxes of motion, and Schrödinger's paradoxes of waves all result from the erroneous conception that position is an actual and simultaneous part of motion. Antimatter is a state of non-matter and an empty state of non-time for all objects. The matter state of an object is the filled state, and the filled state is also a time state. With this positional definition of time, let us examine a statement by Dr. Michio Kaku and Jennifer Trainer in their Beyond Einstein. In QED, quantum electrodynamics, Feynman noticed that antimatter traveling forward in time was indistinguishable from ordinary matter going backward in time. Particles moving backward in time gave a new interpretation of the Feynman diagrams. Assume that we have an electron and anti-electron colliding, releasing a burst of energy. If we reverse the arrow of the anti-electron, making it go backward in time, we can reinterpret this diagram. In the new interpretation, one electron goes forward in time, releases a photon of energy, and the same electron goes backward in time. The theoretical physicist Richard Feynman theorized that antimatter traveling forward in time was indistinguishable from ordinary matter traveling backward in time. In the accompanying Feynman diagrams, the horizontal line at the bottom indicates the space used by particles, and the vertical line at the left indicates a direction of time. When a particle is moving up, it is said to be traveling forward in time, and when a particle moves down, it is said to be traveling backward in time. The first diagram shows two particles in space moving up and traveling forward in time. The particle to the left is an ordinary electron with a negative charge that should be designated positive. The particle to the right is an anti-electron, antimatter, with a positive charge that should be designated negative. Both particles on a collision course disintegrate upon collision with a release of energy, photons in motion. The second Feynman diagram shows only one particle in two different states. On the left, as in the first diagram, there is an ordinary electron traveling forward in time. When this electron emits, it releases energy, photons, and reverses its direction, traveling backward in time. The ordinary electron having emitted and then traveling backward in time is now indistinguishable from the first diagram of the anti-electron traveling forward in time. In continuing this discussion, it may be useful to review Chapter 7 on Matter 1 and Antimatter 0. Feynman diagrams showing present interpretations of particle exchanges relating to time. Within this chapter, these diagrams are reinterpreted. Both particles on the right side of the first and second diagrams have the same charge, and the only difference is on one of direction. One is said to travel forward in time and the other backward in time. This same charge for both particles indicates an antimatter state for both. Did the ordinary electron in the second diagram become an anti-electron, antimatter, when it emitted? Is an antimatter state for the ordinary electron due to its emitting a photon, or is it due to the interpretation of physicists who require time to travel backward? All ordinary particles are emitters. Why does emission change the electron to mimic an anti-electron? Can the action of emitting, characteristic of all objects, answer the salient question, where is all the antimatter? Since the discovery of antimatter in the early 1930s, physicists have been unable to explain why antimatter does not reveal itself in the expected balanced state with ordinary matter. My discussions of diagrams 1 and 2 follow present interpretations of QED. Now I will interpret Feynman's diagrams with my explanation of matter 1 and antimatter 0. An ordinary electron is actually an electron in a filled matter state. An antimatter electron, anti-electron, is the same ordinary electron, but is in an empty non-matter state. As the diagrams show, the signs for positive and negative charges have not been reversed since discovering Franklin's wrong guess early in the 20th century. To correspond with reality, the filled matter state should carry a positive charge and the empty non-matter state a negative charge. The principle has been missed in physics that positive charges indicate the fill of addition plus and negative charges indicate the empty of subtraction minus. This point is reiterated to avoid confusion concerning this departure in interpretation from Feynman's diagrams. Ordinary electrons in actuality are particles that oscillate between two states. One state is the filled matter state after absorption, and the other is the empty antimatter state after emission. The anti-electron traveling forward in time in the first diagram is in reality an ordinary electron in the empty non-matter state. The electron on the left side of the first diagram is also an ordinary electron in a filled matter state. The first diagram shows the opposite nature of two electrons in their filled matter and empty non-matter states. The electron in the antimatter state on the right side of the first diagram implies the electron's prior emission, and the electron in the matter state on the left side implies the electron's prior absorption. The second diagram shows only one electron exhibiting both of its ordinary natural states. An electron in a state of absorption, filled, appears on the left of the diagram and travels in what physicists claim is a forward direction in time. However, in reality, this electron in the filled plus matter state now emits a photon and changes to the empty minus non-matter state of antimatter. This empty antimatter electron now changes direction. The claim by physicists that this change in direction is the electron traveling backwards in time will be examined in this chapter. Now, the indistinguishable nature between the antimatter electron on the right of the first diagram and the electron after emitting a photon on the right side of the second diagram can be understood. The antimatter electron of the first diagram is an electron in an empty state, as is the electron in the second diagram after it emits. They are indistinguishable because both are in the antimatter state of empty through emission. As will be explained, these antimatter states are in reality the empty states of non-time, state of not having time for both electrons. Forward up and backward down should only show an electron's direction of motion for reaching the fill of matter states and the empty of antimatter non-matter states. And direction should only be part of motion for gaining time and non-time. This dual stage, fill and empty, for the electron can be illustrated by the creation of a third diagram. The empty electron comes down from the top because the photon is not allowed to go backward in time. This diagram shows an electron changing from an empty state to a filled state by absorbing a photon instead of emitting a photon, as in the second diagram. The electron emerging from the right side of the diagram is in an empty antimatter state and is said to be traveling backward in time. The electron then absorbs a photon, which changes the electron to a filled matter state and is said to be traveling forward in time. The second diagram shows an electron's motion from a filled 1 state to emission and an empty 0 state. The third diagram shows the electron's motion from an empty 0 state to absorption and a filled 1 state. The second diagram is addition plus, moving to subtraction minus, and the third diagram is subtraction minus, moving to addition plus. Note the symmetry in natures on 1 and off 0 binary oscillations. From these and other examples, we may conclude that all objects function according to this principle. The electron on the left of the first, second, and third diagrams are in the same filled matter state and are said to travel forward in time. The electron on the right of the first diagram, in an antimatter state, is said to travel forward in time. The electrons on the right side of the second and third diagrams in an antimatter state are said to be traveling backwards in time. This new view of electrons produces a dilemma for the contemporary view, namely electrons in the same antimatter state move both forward and backward in the physicist's requirement for time. If there are only electrons that oscillate between matter and antimatter states, then why should the empty antimatter state be required to exist in forward and backward time states? Part of the problem is our present-day view that time can run forwards and backwards when the observable world does not support it. The difficulty with Feynman's diagrams is that they always require time to occur. An electron in an antimatter state is required to travel forward and backward in time. In analyzing the problem, the key phrase in both forward in time and backward in time is in time. To state in time for the diagrams indicates that the electron must always be in a time state either forward or backward. Herein lies the problem. The electron in the empty antimatter state is in reality in a state of being out of time instead of in time. The empty antimatter electron is always in a non-time state, out of time state, regardless of the direction of travel. The empty state after emission is a state of not having time, non-time. The electron's emitting process is a departure of the time state. The electron's filled matter state is always a time state, regardless of which direction it travels. The electron's absorbing process is an arrival at the same time. The solution for explaining the dilemma of electrons in the antimatter state traveling both forward and backward in time is to not invent an electron that always exists in a state of time. The designated directions forward and backward should only be used for showing a direction for motion in reaching time and non-time states for objects. We can now devise an explanation for nature that fits reality. Whatever the electron's direction, a correct diagram should reveal an electron's empty state as a non-time, 0 state, and an electron's filled state as a time, 1 state. In the first diagram, the electron on the left is in a time state and the electron on the right is in a non-time state. The vertical line on the left should only indicate, in this case, the up direction for motion. In the second diagram, a single electron on the left travels up in space in a state of time, emits a photon, and then travels down in a space in a state of non-time. Again, the vertical line should only represent a direction for motion and not time. Time is only part of a particle that is in the absorption matter state of positive energy. In the third diagram, a single electron on the right travels down in space in a non-time state, absorbs a photon, and then travels up in space in a time state. To travel down and up is a function of motion's direction and not a function of time. The object in a time state can be moving or not moving relative to other objects and still emit in reaching a non-time state. Also, the object in a non-time state can be moving or not moving relative to other objects and still absorb in reaching a time state. The difficulty arises when using the phrase in time for all objects, regardless of their state of being. The use of the opposite concept out of time is required for a clarification of being in time. All human awareness, knowledge, and understanding is reached through the antonymic universe of contrasting opposites provided by the binary 0 and 1. All objects reach a time state through absorption and reach a non-time state through emission. The difficulty in understanding time has followed the physicist's failure to recognize that an empty electron, after it emits, is the same as antimatter electron, anti-electron. For this reason, the anti-electron and the emitting electron are indistinguishable in the diagrams. Time travel is stepping from one position to another, where each additional step takes us from a past position to a present position. The future represents steps yet to be reached, and in between these steps, arrival, is the wave, motion, used to reach them. The past leads to future time because the past is indicated by the departure of time. The departure of time is an object having the non-time state necessary to reach the present of a new time state. The past is a removal of time, providing the necessary zero for the one to enter and become the time of the present. The oscillatory nature of the 0 and 1 are fluctuations of the present 1 becoming the past 0 through emission and the past 0 becoming the new present 1 through absorption. The future represents the possibility of a non-time 0 state being removed with the present of a new time 1 state. Energy and time. The equations of quantum mechanics deny an object the simultaneous existence of momentum and position. It was also noticed that time and energy also have the same relationship. Time and energy cannot have a simultaneous existence. This gave me the clue for the identification of the meaning of time. It occurred to me that time and energy have the same relationship as do position and momentum, because both pairs are part of absorption and emission. Time is the positional event of absorption, and energy is the motion that is part of momentum within the emission phase. This is additional evidence of how our understanding of nature can be integrated through the proper use and vision of the zero. Time compared to position, energy compared to momentum were thought to be different concepts, but in the real universe are part of the same phenomena. Momentum is the energy used to leave the whole to reach the positional time of another whole. Mass and energy. Mass relates to all tangible substances representing the physical part of nature. There is usually little difficulty for the human senses to experience mass and matter. Albert Einstein's special theory of relativity explains that mass and energy are equivalent. That energy is equivalent to mass was a surprising disclosure for many. However, to state the equivalence of mass and energy is quite different from understanding its meaning. Indeed, a comprehensive understanding of energy remains an elusive concept. Past and present attempts to explain energy are analogous to circling a destination without reaching it. The physical sciences are still moving toward a specific definition of energy that is still without the knowledge state of absorption. Energy exists in many different forms. These include electrical, sound, nuclear, heat, potential, kinetic, chemical, and radiant energy. Any of these energy forms can be transformed into another energy forms. An energy input from one form of energy will result in an energy output to another form. A hydroelectric dam is an example wherein the input energy of water is transferred to the output energy of electricity. Chapter 7 on Matter 1 and Antimatter 0 revealed Paul Dirac's correct prediction of antimatter through his concentration on the negative energy roots of E equals mc squared. Prior to Dirac, physicists concentrated on the positive energy roots of E equals mc squared. The existence of both positive and negative energy indicates opposites necessary to define any process. To understand one energy concept is to understand the other. In Chapter 7, the conclusion was reached that negative energy is the subtraction of matter and positive energy is the addition of matter. During the emission of matter, there is a release and departure of energy. This results in the non-matter empty state of antimatter. The antimatter state is a negative energy state of objects after they emit. During the absorption of matter, there is an entering and an arrival of energy. This results in a filling of the matter state, which is a positive energy state for objects that absorb. The conclusion is that absorption is an energy input and emission is an energy output. Input yields positive energy for an object and output yields negative energy for an object. A question to consider is, if the arrival of matter, absorption, is positive energy and the departure of matter, emission, is negative energy, then how does energy relate to matter? This can be answered by determining how matter departs and arrives. What specific function is used by matter to leave the whole of one object's specific function is used by matter and to arrive in the whole of another object. Humans also use this function in transporting the matter of their body from one place to another. Matter acquires action for its emission and absorption events through the function of motion. A definition of energy can now be precisely stated. Energy is the motion of matter relative to objects that subtract motion through the output of emission and relative to objects that add motion through the input of absorption. Energy output, emission, is a negative energy process for the object emitting because emission results in a subtraction minus of motion energy. Energy input, absorption, is a positive energy process for the object absorbing because absorption results in an addition, zero, of motion energy. More simply stated, energy can be defined as mass in motion or defined as energy in motion. The idea that motion and energy are equivalent produces a clear mental picture of this natural phenomenon. Energy is the motion used for all emission, departure, and absorption, arrival, events in nature. Energy becomes comprehensible by separating it from its beginning for an object at departure and its ending for an object at our arrival. To understand a loss of energy by an object's output is to understand a gain of energy by an object's input, and conversely, one defines the other. This view, however, is not possible without both the positive plus, fill of a whole, and the negative minus, empty of a whole. The use of the zero must first be identified before reaching a specific definition of energy. The insistence on energy, motion, being simultaneous with time, position, is the prime misconception leading to difficulties in interpreting nature. Identifying the nature of the zero and the one, as the one enters and leaves the zero, is necessary to designate opposites for the creation of definitions. Energy transformations are restatements of motion transformations. Motion, energy, is transferred from one object to another by the output, emission, of motion and the input, absorption, of motion. The output of energy is a subtraction of motion for the emitting object that leads to an addition of motion, input of energy, for the absorbing object. The conservation laws of mass energy involve conservation of the physical mass and the motion energy used by the physical for its in and out events. The law of conservation of mass energy can now be stated. Mass and the motion energy of mass cannot be created or destroyed. The amount of mass and the amount of motion energy of mass is always conserved, but the shape and form of mass will change, and the input and output transfers of the motion energy of mass will change. Human absorption of food, air, and water extracts the internal motion of these essentials for our energy input. This extracted motion is then stored as potential energy for its future use as kinetic energy, that is the human body's motion. Motion has been transferred from the internal structure of food to the internal structure of humans. The use of human motion is another energy output leading to an energy input for the object absorbing human motion. We input energy by taking motion away from objects, and in using it, we give it back. Energy, motion, is always conserved by its continuing transfer through input, absorption, and output, emission. It is the motion, energy of matter, using the non-physical that explains universal action. The departure of motion gives us information on an object's output and its loss of energy, negative energy. The arrival of motion gives us information on an object's input and its gain of energy, positive energy. Energy is motion that is manifested in a wave. Energy, motion, is used through the attraction force with its availability of the 0 and 1. The repulsion force guides this motion, energy, and is responsible for the transfer of motion to the absorber. When motion enters the hole of the absorber, the hole contains and stops motion. But motion does not disappear. It relocates by becoming part of the absorber. The absorbed object gives its motion to the absorber. The absorbed is now part of the motion transferred to the absorber. This is the positive energy, matter state, for an object absorbing. Absorption occurs because the motional energy transfer has resulted in a non-motional relationship between the absorbed and absorber. Energy ceases relative to the absorbed and to the absorber. Energy absorption occurs when the positional time event is reached. The motion of the absorbed is transferred through repulsion. Where the absorbed cannot go, to the absorber. The absorber now has the energy, motion, input to use attraction 1 to 0 in moving to where it can go. The absorbed is now carried along with the absorber's acquired motional energy from the absorbed. The attraction force uses energy, motion, for its arrival, and then the repulsion force transfers this energy for another arrival. The repulsion force both guides motion, energy, and transfers motion. Precisely because energy is motion, energy is always used when there is an absorber to absorb this energy from the absorbed. According to the law of conservation of charge, there is always available an empty minus object to provide the energy input of absorption. For every emission creating an empty subtraction, negatively charged minus state, there is also an absorption creating the fill addition of a positive charged plus state. The conservation of charge is also the conservation of matter, 1, and antimatter, 0. The matter state is a positive charge and the antimatter state is a negative charge. This indicates that energy always has the availability for absorption, that is, energy, motion, entering the 0 of an antimatter absorber. Positive and negative charges apply to all objects and are not merely limited to the electromagnetic domain. All objects exchange, absorb, and emit in reaching a positive and negative charge. Every structure, microcosm or macrocosm, reaches its own positive matter and negative antimatter fluctuations according to how it is structured to emit minus and absorb plus. An example of motion transfers, energy transfers, is the ignition of fuel emission and motion of heat, followed by the transfer of heat motion to water motion. steam pressure, and then the transfer of steam motion to turbine motion. This is followed by turbine motion to generator motion, then generator motion to electron motion, which is transferred to an electric lamp, and the motion of radiant energy, motion of light particles. In each of these conversions and transfers of energy, motion is used to explain energy. The in of motions lead to the out of motions, and the out of motion leads to the in of motion. Physicists have understood for more than a century that high energy moves to low energy. High energy is an area of positive energy, addition of energy, which is synonymous with higher, more motion, and low energy area of negative energy, subtraction of energy, synonymous with lower, less motion. Why is high motion attracted to low motion? High motion in one area means an increase of emission and absorption. With higher oscillation, the availability of zeros is reduced. Lower motion is a decrease of emission and absorption with more zeros available. The attraction of high motion to low motion is the positive energy attraction of ones to the negative energy attraction of zeros. This principle describes nature's attempt to reach a balanced state of positive 1 and negative 0. The more ones, the less zeros; the more zeros, the less ones. This imbalance of zeros and ones is what drives the action of high energy to low energy. A wave is energy, motion, that is continually providing objects with accessibility through entry into an organized whole. Upon entering a whole, this energy is absorbed, transferred, and is followed by another emission to absorption event. There is an input to reach another output to reach another input, and so on the cycle continues. Motion and energy are continuous, as inputs result in outputs and outputs result in inputs. However, negative energy is a discontinuation of energy after output. There is a non-energy, negative energy state for every energy, positive energy state. The empty antimatter state follows a release of energy, while the filled matter state follows the arrival of energy. The universe, instead of being composed of only energy, is an overall combination of balanced states of energy and non-energy. The arrival and use of energy, motion, indicates the prior condition of non-arrival and non-use of energy. Energy and time means motion and position. To describe energy is to describe waves. Objects use energy, waves, for propagation, emission, for entering the whole, and a positional time event. Energy output, emission, momentum, and wave are all related by the concept of motion toward the whole of an absorber. Energy input, absorption, position, and the collapse of the wave are all related by the concept of non-motion outside the parameters of the organized whole of an absorber. Physicists have noticed that in the equations of quantum mechanics, energy and time do not commute in the same way that momentum and position do not commute. To not commute means that to have only energy or momentum is the exclusion of time or position. To not commute is the inability to have either energy and time or momentum and position as simultaneous events. I have concluded that energy and time have the same relationship with momentum and position because each pair is composed of emission and absorption. Energy and momentum are part of the stage of emission, while time and position are part of the stage of absorption. Time is position, absorption, and energy is momentum, emission. Because time and position involve absorption and energy and momentum involve emission, it can also be concluded that emission and absorption do not commute. The inability to mathematically commute is a mathematical statement for the inability of emission and absorption to exist simultaneously. Energy to time, momentum to position, and emission to absorption do not commute mathematically because quantum equations are involved with the actualities of momentum and position. Quantum reality is a reality of nature where position is not allowed to be placed upon motion and motion is not allowed to be placed upon position. A particle's position within the wave function, motion, is denied for this reason. The mathematics is denying the claimed simultaneity, namely the actual simultaneous existence of motion and position. To be certain about position, time, is to have the uncertain ignorance of momentum, energy, because momentum ceased with its positional arrival. To be certain about momentum is to have the uncertain ignorance of position, because positional absorption ceased with the emissional momentum. Certain means knowledge and uncertain means ignorance. Certain and uncertain are opposites that revolve around each other, one after the other. The uncertainty of position is the existence of motion reaching for the certainty of position. The uncertainty of motion is the existence of position necessary to start the certainty of motion. To integrate time, position, and absorption as one concept, and energy, momentum, and emission as another concept, is to show that one is involved with occupying a whole and the other is involved with leaving a whole. One concept involves input and the other involves output. Energy is matter in motion, and mass is matter's positional relationship in non-motion. One is energy, mass, and the other is positional mass. Mass and energy are always relative to the observer. What may mean positional mass for one observer may mean energy mass for another observer. Positional mass is arrival and energy mass is departure. While aboard an airplane in flight, human mass has a positional mass relationship to the airplane and at the same time has an energy mass relationship to the Earth. Concurrently, human mass on the Earth has a positional mass relationship with the Earth and an energy mass relationship to the airplane. All human mental absorption is a positional mass relationship of arrival and depends upon the prior condition of departure and the energy mass of motion. Mass and energy, thus, are not equivalent relative to the observer. Either the energy mass emission of the wave exists disallowing observation, or positional mass occurs allowing observation, absorption. Mass at rest is a positional, static relationship relative to any other object. Energy is mass in a motional relationship relative to any other object. Newton's first law of motion concerns mass in a state of rest and mass in a state of motion. Positional mass is simply mass in a state of rest, absorption, relative to any other object, and energy mass is mass in a state of motion, emission, relative to any other object. When we sense heat, 1, it is motion, energy, being transferred through absorption to us, and when we sense cold, 0, it is motion, energy, being transferred away, emission from us. We can receive too much energy to our detriment, or too much energy can be taken away, also to our detriment. In fewer words, we can have too much input, absorption, or too much output, emission. We can acquire too many zeros, negative energy, by the departure of ones, or too many ones, positive energy, and the subsequent departure of zeros. Nuclear, electrical, and fossil fuel energy conversions provide additional motion that allows humans easier and more rapid emission to absorption processes. Access to more motion energy increases our time events, enabling us to emit and absorb faster. The conversion of machine motion to the facilitation of human motion adds to life, time, and is the basis of survival for the vast majority of humans.